honor to be here. I recognize the importance of this space and those who have preceded and those who will be after me, and it's an honor, so I appreciate it. And the hosts, a very special thanks to all of you for being super accommodating since just even I've been here. So thank you very much. And a salute to all my comrades who have come through on their own time. Appreciate you. So the goal here, I'm going to talk for, I don't know, roughly 30 to 45 minutes at the most, and then open it up for Q&A and discussion, which is always my preference. A couple of quick corrections. So I do need to shout out the fact that we are now with Black Liberation Media. I also need to shout out the fact that the most important thing about my bio was left out, which is that I'm a co-host to Saturdays with Renee. So, yeah, the award-winning journalist. In her book, The Other Side of Terror, Black Women in the Culture of the U.S. Empire, Dr. Erica Edwards describes what I am trying to do here, and always in classrooms or podcasts or discussions at the dinner table. Shout out to my daughter who is also here. In her discussion of June Jordan's effort at linguistic or narrative preservation, Dr. Edwards says, quote, "The language that Jordan was desperately trying to preserve, the language of survival, Black English, we gonna make you answer for this shit, or it's on. What you think would happen if every time they kill a Black boy, then we kill a cop. I also want to preserve a language of survival, one that manifests in critical analysis, political organization, and militant action." So as I said, I'm going to talk for about 30, 45 minutes. Then I have a couple questions I can throw out, or we can just respond to whatever comments, queries, conundrums, catechisms you all have. The summary of the frame that I'm going to try to put together for this talk is in 5 components. One that centers colonialism, prisons as warfare, as Dr. Orasami Burton talks about. Media and public opinion with a specific and brief look at propaganda. Some foundations for a preferred analysis, looking at quickly Obama and the new Jim Crow. And then a conclusion calling for, as always, a radical assumption of power, political power. So as it relates to colonialism, there's a lot of different forms: settler, internal, domestic. However you all want to define it is largely fine with me, not to be disrespectful of the important nuances. But for me, the important point is that they all involve establishing a set of social relationships that I oversimplify to involve 2 interrelated phases. First, a very material process of conquering land and labor. As Fanon said, that's all that colonialism is. The extraction of natural resources and the redistribution of wealth produced upwards to where today Forbes can report almost proudly that we have roughly 800 people worth over $6 trillion. And I keep wanting to, I say that over and over and over again because I think it should inspire the kind of rage that would be appropriate to that kind of maldistribution. As Eugene Puryear shows in his Shackled and Chained book, The Rise of Prisons tracks both with that sort of colonial expansion and that kind of gross inequality that it produces. That colonial expansion of this country brought with it the need to subjugate further the labor that was being oppressed in various ways on those lands. And the need to redistribute and manage the labor of poor whites that was meant to, and at the same time resubjugate Black labor, or as Puryear concludes, capitalist development is deeply entangled with the roots of mass incarceration, or with the mass incarceration system. This is how we end up with the emerging police forces, each bound to a need to control the labor of the enslaved in the South and the wage enslaved of the North. So it is always interesting to revisit the history of the rise of the police in this country, that in the South, they were developed, selected by poor whites, selected out of the pool of poor whites, themselves made poor through the process of enslavement. Both Du Bois and Marx reached a similar conclusion separately, that 7% of the white South owned roughly 77 to 80% of the enslaved, meaning that most poor whites were just that. So what do? You hire them to police the enslaved, who, of course, would need policing, because it's always important to remember that slavery was forced into change by rebellion, not the whims of liberalism. And in the North, the police population was called from poor whites needing to police the property of the rich, who were the working people. So they hired private police and so on, and there we go. So the police, of course, are always here to protect property and to manage the labor and the populations that are created through the gross inequality and suffering as a result in various ways. So it is in this context that we can better understand the initial material purpose or function of prisons, the suppression and maintenance of the recalcitrant, the among those already targeted for oppression and whose failure to comply is rebranded as criminal, requiring the evolution of the police state we heard so eloquently described by Dead Prez. And if folks remember at that time when Dead Prez came out, good Lord, like damn. Like my man Dr. Burroughs used to say of our generation, the hip hop generation, that we thought we were gonna win. And it was like that, it did have that vibe of, oh man, we might actually win. We will, no doubt. Okay, right on. So as Dr. Burton starts off in his book, he starts off in Tip of the Spear, that is, this immediate classic, with a discussion, a reference to Queen Mother Moore talking about the recaptivity of prisoners who are already colonized. So again, starting with that very material need to colonize, the extending the imperial process down specifically to target, in this case, Black and brown America. And this is why Dr. Burton says that prisons are war. They are state strategies of race war, class war, colonization, and counterinsurgency. Which leads me to the second phase that I'm oversimplifying here, which involves all manner of immaterial methods that intend to shape our cognitive infrastructure. As Jen Easterly, the former NSA agent and CISA representative, now doing something else spooky, I'm sure, but that's what how she described it. From the perspective of the rulers to manipulate or shape our cognitive infrastructure. That phrase is wild. Or manage its development and manipulate us via what George Creel said 100 years ago, through the conquering of our convictions. He was asked, how did you make all these poor white boys want to go fight and die in the trenches of World War I? He said, we conquered their convictions. I said, damn. I mean, damn. That's so, I think when I read the quote I put here, it's like, it's really heavy to think of it, like that's what you really wanted to do? So it's not just branding and marketing and advertising and music and movies. You're trying to conquer our very convictions. So our focus today is how we are encouraged to understand and respond to prisons and prison or all rebellion. In other words, the liberal counterinsurgency and its narrative impact on how we understand prisons and prison rebellion will be my focus or point of departure. What is liberal counterinsurgency? Again, quoting Orasami Burton, who I keep saying I put this into text because he said it in the context of our interview, but without reading it, he just said it so fluidly, and I was like, damn, I'm gonna write that down. He said, the liberal counterinsurgency is used by the ruling class to stabilize imperial power by assimilating marginalized groups into positions of relative authority in the hopes that their ascendance will obscure the conditions of naked violence or even encourage people to want to advance within that structure to become an overseer. That is bars. And he said that just, but that's what's going on here. To stabilize imperial power and assimilate marginalized groups to obscure the ever less obscurable naked violence, and even worse, encourage us to become part of the overseeing force. It's important, I think, to note that Dr. Burton said this in the context of talking about how the current administration is actually attacking a lot of the liberal counterinsurgency apparatus through DEI and even the Department of Education and the FBI. He's talking all this trash about it. And it's like, on the one hand, it's no, that's terrible. And on the other hand, it's like, maybe he's on to something. But the point is, for many of us, The apparatus of education, what Donald Spivey once brilliantly called, was meant to replace the stability lost with the demise of slavery. We've been looking at the apparatus of education as a hostile colonial imperial weapon. So to see it being attacked, even from this perspective, is in some ways, I don't know, destabilizing, interesting. Maybe we can come back to that. I don't know. It's almost weird. However, my favorite component of this frame of colonialism as a model is its inherent connection via imperialism to the entire so-called global South, and of course, the anti-colonial struggles of those people. And perfectly summarizing this bridge to the international is a point made by Malcolm X a long time ago, that the police do locally what the military does internationally. As it pertains to the immaterial aspect of colonial rule and the role media play in that process, Malcolm was again prescient in his depiction or description of the context and process. He said that being in a position to suck the economic blood of our community, they, that is the colonial ruling elite, white oligarchy, capitalist, corporate, fascist rulers, however you want to, control the radio, they control the radio programs that cater to us. They control the newspapers, the advertising that cater to us. They control our minds. They end up controlling our civic organizations. And I love that he made that connection. From media to our political organizations are all manipulated in a very similar way. So to this point of prisons is war, I argue that prisons, this is, again, who am I quoting here? Probably Worry. I argue that is Ori, it is Ori. I argue that prisons in the United States should be understood as institutions of low-intensity warfare that masquerade as apolitical instruments of crime control. In a recent essay, Ori again talks about using Stuart Hall, who I love that he works this in as a you know, formerly wannabe media studies guy. I like the reference to Stuart Hall, and where Burton talks about in Policing the Crisis, that classic text from Stuart Hall and others. The cultural theorist Hall and his co-authors demonstrate how mainstream media relies on agents of the state to be primary definers of any given situation. Think of the press conference after any major crime. Police and other civic authorities make statements that become the official narrative about what has happened. By contrast, incarcerated people, their loved ones, and advocates constantly struggle to have their voices and perspectives heard and taken seriously. This asymmetrical struggle to define the truth and narrate history is what I call narrative war, and has important consequences for what we think we know about prisons and political struggle. Which leads me to the next section or topic, media and public opinion. It is always important to understand that media are always taken far more seriously by the ruling elite and imperial conquerors than many of us are encouraged to accept them to be. A great amount of effort goes into encouraging us to accept a media environment as natural, normal, even neutral in some ways. But this is again why Marshall McLuhan once said, we don't know who discovered water, but we know it was not the fish. An all-pervasive environment is always beyond perception. And I remember Chayla Sandoval years ago talking about how we're born into a context, a colonial context, where we are being mined and we are being surveilled and monitored and raised into a certain state of consciousness about who, what class, race, identity, nationality, religion we are, and then put to work in service based on those imposed identities and concepts. 100 years ago, literally almost 100 years ago, Harold Laswell, one of the primary shapers of the US mass communications system and early research framing, said that propaganda is concerned with the management of opinions and attitudes by the direct manipulation of social suggestion rather than by altering other conditions in the environment or in the organism. Management of opinions and attitudes rather than altering the conditions in the environment or organism. Propaganda is one of the three chief implements of operation against a belligerent enemy. And we should understand, going back to the way the newspapers of the day referred to Nat Turner as an insurgent, that many of us, all of us in here, represent this insurgent belligerent enemy. So military pressure, economic pressure, he described, and then of course propaganda all work as part of a uniform process to manipulate. And then again, quoting Laswell, the bonds of personal loyalty and affection which bound a man to his chief have long since dissolved. Monarchy and class privilege have gone the way of the flesh, and idolatry of the individual passes for the official religion of democracy. It is an atomized world in which individual whims have wider play than ever before, and it requires more strenuous exertions to coordinate and unify than formerly. The new antidote to willfulness is propaganda. If the mass will be free of chains of iron, it must accept its chains of silver. God. It will not love, honor, or obey. It must not expect to escape seduction, he said. And this is someone well funded by the ruling elite to produce studies of how to manipulate people and to what purpose, to what end. We're not changing the conditions. We're going to work on their attitudes towards those conditions. And when it comes to the discussion or primary focus of prisons or prison rebellion, we're not going to change the conditions of the prison or that produce prison rebellion. We're going to change the conditions with which those histories are even considered, if at all. Next section, a little bit on propaganda. I would definitely encourage folks to check out this wonderful discussion my colleagues here hosted a couple months ago, where Mtume and Renee and I had a really good discussion about a brief history of propaganda. But it is, long story short, related very much to this imperial project. How do we produce those primary definitions that Stuart Hall was talking about of what it will mean to engage a police force that is ever increasing on the basis of not changing conditions, but how we interpret those conditions. So as Alford and Secker in their book, National Security State, have said, the content of film and television is directly, regularly, and secretly determined by the US government, led by the CIA and Pentagon. More visible since the 1980s is what we identify as a distinct genre, national security cinema, namely those films that follow self-serving official histories and exalt in the righteousness of US foreign policy. And yet the reality of a slick and extensive military PR machine is the entertainment industry only became apparent to us as long-standing researchers in the field quite recently. They assess, longer story short, that there are well over 1,133 TV titles, 1,947 in total, counting film and series that are all developed by the Department of Defense. Of course, shows like 24, Homeland, NCIS, and many more all fit within that. Of course, films like Top Gun are added to that, all kinds of, for military recruitment, all to set this condition by how we would understand this environment that is increasingly a police state, and as Malcolm said, connected to the imperial processes overseas through the military. By the way, so how are we supposed to interpret when Trump says he wants to target AFRICOM? No, wait. All right. Now, there are some special features of propaganda as it pertains specifically to Black America, specifically the suppression, erasure, rebranding of radical movements and ideas. And I'm thinking here again of, I know with space, I don't want to get into, again, I always get scared to bring up his name now, but when Frank Wilderson talks about Max Julian going from being killed as the radical leader in the film Uptight, comes back a couple years later as the Mac. I think that is not to be an underappreciated facet of the problem here. My generation grew up watching, many of us didn't even see Uptight. Almost all of us saw the Mac. In Uptight, Max Julian is a revolutionary, is a revolutionary who was, of course, killed by the state. He has to die on screen to be rebranded and be rebuilt as a pimp a couple years later. That's my version of this summary. This also includes an incorporation of Black characters as participants and even chiefs. The stereotypically angry and yelling Black male captain for a long time seemed to dominate films. When it comes specifically to Black women, coming back to Dr. Erica Edwards, she says, quote, "The imperial grammars of Blackness are the structures of communication that translate Black pain and Black thriving into the speech of US empire. Not just words and phrases, but gestures of affirmation and empowerment that weave Black aspiration into national delusions of domination. Throughout the late 20th and early 21st centuries, fantasies, images, narratives, slogans, and trinkets of Black women's freedom and achievement in the chambers of Congress on t-shirts and buttons, uniformed on street corners and offshore on the stages of festivals and world meetings and everywhere you can imagine, served as prosthetics for an empire desperate for multicultural representation as the sign of its righteousness and the ground of its tenuous authority." And again, this is why, well, I'll come back to that in a minute. So I did want to sort of shoehorn in some discussion of what for me has become, I'll summarize here, the foundations for a preferred analysis, subtitled Obama and the New Jim Crow. And I went back and read the essay by Dr. Greg Thomas, which is on imixwhatilike.org, which I still think is one of the more important critiques of the new Jim Crow, not just because it was criticizing a book, but what it was saying about the moment we were in, this Obama moment. We just celebrated, well, 5 years ago was the 10th anniversary of the new Jim Crow, and I saw some discussions of it that were reminding me of its continued impact and why Thomas's critique was so important. And what it was speaking to was this moment where Obama is elected, and there's this suggestion that, even as Dr. Erica Edwards, she even in one of her book talks, she talked about that she voted for Obama. She thought that she had to be, this was a turning point for her to realize what that wasn't as a moment. But there was this, for those who remember, this massive wave of propaganda that was suggesting that we were overcoming something, that we were advancing somewhere, that there was hope in this system. And then here comes the new Jim Crow, which got a lot of attention, brought up, developed a lot of important conversations, but reflected that same kind of worldview. So for some of us, Obama represented 20 years ago the process I have been describing here, with the biggest of shout outs to the late Glenn Ford and Bruce Dixon of Black Agenda Report. I can safely count myself among those who, again, using the terms I'm engaging today, was the liberal counterinsurgency and the epitome of imperial grammars of Blackness. In fact, that which Edwards says she has had to overcome herself. We all have had to overcome a version of this. Some of us didn't have the Obama particular affliction, but other versions we had to overcome. That is, Obama represented a promise of what liberal forms of resistance are meant to produce. This is why, as we've been discussing about the soundtrack to a coup d'etat, it bookends in the frames of liberal performative rebellion as the solution to an ongoing colonialism. And it did take me 3 times and several discussions to see that. But so in other words, what was the solution to the colonial situation in 2008? Elect Obama. Literarily, Greg Thomas demonstrates what my comrade, Dr. Todd Stephen Burroughs, has been pointing out as the relationship since 2008, that all books must present Obama's presence as a progress and hope. Like there was a minute, like all these books written by Black authors had this chapter at the end where, Obama was, was like, I know I just wrote about a whole bunch of bad stuff, but Obama just got, we almost there. So in his critique, worthy of some note due to somewhat recent 10th anniversary continued impact, the importance is not for its particular subject, but what Alexander's work represented then and now, a liberal counterinsurgent model of addressing the violence of colonialism and specifically mass incarceration or the police state. So as Thomas points out, George Jackson's analysis of prisons and prisoners and fascism is erased when he said, though I know I am a victim of social injustice and economic pressure, and though I understand the forces that work to drive so many of our kind to places like this and to mental institutions, I can't help but know that I proceeded wrong somewhere. I could have done a lot worse. You know, our people react in different ways to this neo-slavery. Some just give in completely and join the other side. They join some Christian cult and cry out for integration. There are the ones who doubt themselves the most, is what George wrote in Soledad Brother. And Thomas's point was he was already calling it neo-slavery. Why are we being backtracked to call it a new Jim Crow? Thomas says, magically disappeared are the Black Panther Party, George Jackson, and prison-based movements. And the prison-based movement he led, which burst into the Attica Rebellion, as well as various and sundry international and transracial solidarities of world historical significance. Her book turns away, that is, The New Jim Crow, turns away from a long tradition and a wide range of anti-racist critical frameworks, ones which zero in on institutional racism and the political economy of racism, as well as blood in my eyes, overt, self-interdicting and unconscious racisms in the plural. These are precisely the traditions and critical frameworks silently and systematically renounced by Alexander's The New Jim Crow, which, like the US corporate media, will only see racism when it's overt, conscious, obvious, and at the bottom, publicly avowed or confessed. Her American racism must always be uniform, static, and undisguised. In other words, utterly ridiculous in retrospect. All right, so as I head towards the conclusion so we can get to some Q&A, I had to add this in because for some reason I found this article and literally read it this morning on the train up here, had to add a comment or two about it because I thought it was so dope and deep. So I said, dope and deep. In an article by, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing this, in an article by Arthur Asseraf, Mass Media and the Colonial Informant. It's fascinating, written in 2021. The story of the simultaneous rise of both colonialism and mass media and the particular role that could be played by the intermediary, the mediating informant, the colonial go-between, translating the mandates of the ruling elite in ways acceptable to both those who rule and those to be ruled, and of course, benefiting in the process. In this case, the protagonist was the anti-Kendrick Lamar performing in his Cash App commercial, intentionally misreporting the facts of the Algerian colonies back to French authorities. This fascinating true story, it is Djebari, if I'm saying his name correctly, who created in the late 19th century and actually played a role participating, which led to a fascinating section of this article about the role North Africans played in the European colonial process of the so-called scramble for Africa. Fascinating. But its point is that we are, through a process of colonialism, encouraged in ways to become the mediating conduits through which our oppression is explained to our communities, justified, resisted safely. This article analyzes the art of making yourself into a conduit in the modern information. The simultaneous expansions of colonialism and mass media generated an environment where information had to appear depersonalized to be taken seriously, and yet where only certain individuals could have access to particular kinds of knowledge. This encouraged a practice of passing off one's own fictions as somebody else's information, especially for colonized subjects. So it's a fast, so what I meant by the Cash App reference is that this is that brilliant commercial that came out some years ago that shows what the colonial process is. It showed it. It starts off with the brother, you just see some brother on screen and he's using the typical AAVE speech. You know, brother, I got, some investment, and I drop some money in the thing, and then I try to flip it, and the camera pulls back and you see he's talking to Kendrick. And Kendrick is listening. And then he says, all right. And then he starts to take what the brother says to him and turns and he starts distilling that. And well, what he's actually saying is, and then he pulls back, you see he's talking to this white businessman. And then the white businessman hears what Kendrick is saying. And he says, oh no, what you need to tell your buddy is that he should have done this, that, and the third. And then Kendrick says, oh, okay. And he turns, he says, nah, see what you need to do is flip, and then it's a Cash App commercial. And I said, this is the dopest commercial ever. This is the most explanatory reveal confession of a commercial I've ever seen. Kendrick playing the Colonial informant. Now, I know he's everybody's hero right now, but I'm just saying. So this is why I've argued, and some of my comrades have evolved this concept, the Vernon philosophy of Black media avoidance as a stepping stone, a bridge to political anger that is described brilliantly in Blood in My Eye. And as I try to put in the note here, the anger should be the blood in all of our eyes. We should all become Georges. We need the George Jackson political party and overt, militant, explicit attempts to achieve political power. That's the only, so the Vernon philosophy is just an argument, long story short, that no oppressed group should ever look to see itself represented in media targeting them as part of their colonial process. And the more we like it, the more we should resist it. Be critical of it. Ask, how did they find that colonial informant that's gonna change this story into something that's gonna work for me? How did they get me? Yeah. Yeah. And then you got to work in collectives because you can't do this by yourself. You will not. And then that's why George said we need three things. The army, the secret army, you know, come on now. I'm not doing that. I can barely, I'm about to sit down and then about to sit down. I'm not doing that. We need an underground press. An alternative press that would help popularize the radical movements we need to be part of. And then, of course, we need a militant, aggressive way to engage the electoral political process. And that part we need to be working on more and more aggressively every day. Erica Edwards invites a critical assessment of the imperial grammars of Blackness and the preservation of a kind of linguistic or communicative response that is aware of the increased incorporation of Black liberation and all liberation struggles by an also increasingly sophisticated state-run, liberal, counterinsurgent media environment. I've always said that in my classrooms, as I would say here tonight, in any podcast or in whatever other work, I want to be part of an interruptive moment that preserves some of this language of Black liberation and all liberation, that challenges the liberal counterinsurgency. And I would want to encourage that more of us become that, become the insurgent force that requires more of the forms of repression that we're seeing evolve, that the conflict of sorts has to occur. We have to force it by being more of a problem. Big shout out to my comrades. I will say this, I was listening to the Remix Morning Show today on Black Liberation Media. And I will say, Kamau and Kim co-hosting this morning, I thought did something really important. As largely non-religious materialists, Kim started with a prayer, singing a prayer that was encouraging us to not fall for the hate and the repression. Kamau joined in by saying our response to these increasing oppressive moments should be more aggressive, militant, organized reaction. So any tendency we feel to give up, to slow down, to back down should be resisted and be recognized as part of that liberal counterinsurgent effort that is so important here. So I'll end here by saying that the point that preservation is, the point of that preservation is made well by a statement of Frank Wilderson, where he said once upon a time, I don't hate police brutality, I hate the police. And with that, I'll stop there. Thank you very much. I look forward to comments, questions, queries, conundrums, catechisms, cacophony. Please don't do that.
Thank you so much, Dr. Jared. Yeah, let's give another round of applause. That was great. So we'll open it up for some Q&A. We'll open up for some Q&A, and we'll start with a round here. I'll start with this side, and then I'll move to this side.
And what did you sacrifice? Calm, kindness, kinship, love.
I made my mind a sunless space. I share my dreams with ghosts. I wake up every day to an equation I wrote 15 years ago from which there's only one conclusion. I'm damned for what I do. My anger, my ego, my unwillingness to yield, my eagerness to fight, that set me on a path from which there's no escape. I yearn to be a savior against injustice without contemplating the cost, and by the time I look down, there's no longer any ground beneath my feet. What is my sacrifice? I'm condemned to use the tools of my enemy to defeat them. I burn my decency for someone else's future. I burn my life to make a sunrise that I know I'll never see. Now, the ego that started this fight will never have a mirror or an audience or the light of gratitude. So what do I sacrifice? Everything, 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 everything.
I mix what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like, what I like.